Stop! I'll buy that fat girl, the giant mountain man shouted, and then he did the unthinkable. In a dusty frontier town, a drunken father tries to sell his own daughter like cattle. The crowd jeers, the church bell tolls, and shame hangs heavy in the air until a towering stranger slams silver on the table and takes her away. But instead of cruelty, she finds firelight, food, and an unexpected kindness that changes everything. Whispers spread across the valley. Why would a feared loner rescue a girl the world mocked? And what secret makes her worth more than gold to the ruthless men riding hard to claim her, as thundering hooves draw near and the noose of the railroad tightens? Will this mountain giant's unthinkable act of mercy become the fight that saves her life, or the choice that destroys them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The lantern light cast dancing shadows across the livery stable's rough-hewn walls. Chloe May's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood trembling beside the wagon, her father's cruel words still ringing in her ears. The smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies pressed in around her, mixing with the sweet hay and leather scents of the stable. $5! Someone shouted from the back. $3 and a broken mule! Another voice called, followed by harsh laughter. Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, her woolen shawl offering little protection against the biting January wind that whistled through the gaps in the stable walls. Snow melted off the men's boots, creating dark puddles on the packed earth floor. Her father, Luther May, swayed atop the wagon bed, his face flushed from drink. "Come on, boys," he slurred, gesturing wildly. "Surely my fat girl's worth more than that. She can cook, clean, and read too, though what good that does on a farm, I never knew." More jeers erupted. Someone threw a clump of dirty snow that barely missed her skirts. Chloe blinked back tears, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She'd endured their mockery before, but never like this, never with her own father trying to sell her like a piece of livestock. The stable doors suddenly creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air that made the lanterns flutter. The crowd fell silent as a massive figure ducked through the doorway. Kent McKenna's buffalo coat was dusted with snow, his dark beard flecked with ice. He stood head and shoulders above the other men, and the crowd parted instinctively before him. Chloe had seen the mountain man in town before, though he rarely spoke to anyone. Rumors swirled about his past, that he'd fought as a scout in the war, that he lived alone in a cabin up in the high country, that he was more comfortable with wolves than people. His presence commanded attention, and even her drunken father stopped mid-sentence. Kent's bootsteps echoed in the sudden quiet as he strode toward the wagon. His face was unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but his eyes, when they met Chloe's for a brief moment, held something she couldn't quite name. Not mockery or cruelty, but something else entirely. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. The sound of silver coins hitting the wagon boards rang through the stable as he slammed them down. "Stop!" His voice boomed off the rafters, making several men jump. "I'll buy that fat girl!" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Chloe's mind whirled as she stared at the mountain man, trying to understand what was happening. Was this rescue, or something worse? Luther May scrambled forward on his knees, greedily counting the coins. $20 silver, he announced, eyes gleaming. "Sold to Kent McKenna!" Whispers erupted around them. "Mad McKenna's finally lost his mind," someone muttered. "What's he want with her?" "Reckon he's been alone in them mountains too long," another voice answered. Kent ignored them all, his attention fixed on Luther May. "Get down," he ordered, his voice hard as iron. "Sign over the contract and we're done." Her father fumbled in his coat for a scrap of paper and pencil, nearly falling off the wagon in his haste. His handwriting was barely legible as he scrawled out the terms, but his signature at the bottom was clear enough. He thrust the paper at Kent, who folded it carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "Come," Kent said to Chloe. the first word he'd addressed to her directly. His tone was gentler now, though still gruff. Chloe's legs felt wooden as she took a step forward. The crowd parted again, making way for them to pass. Some faces showed pity, others amusement, but most just seemed eager for the spectacle to be over so they could return to their drinks. The blast of cold air as they stepped outside nearly took her breath away. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the wind. Kent's buffalo coat suddenly settled around her shoulders, its weight and warmth surprising her. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, and despite her fear, she found herself drawing it closer. "My wagon's this way," Kent said, pointing down the street where a team of horses stood waiting. He didn't touch her or try to hurry her along, just walked beside her through the deepening snow. Behind them, the sounds from the livery stable grew louder again as the crowd returned to their drinking and betting. Chloe could hear her father's voice among them, already spending his silver on more whiskey. She blinked back, fresh tears, determined not to look back. The wagon was solid and well-maintained, the horses stamping impatiently in their harness. Kent helped her up onto the seat, his hands strong but careful. Once she was settled, he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It's an hour's ride to my cabin," he said as they started moving. "Road's rough in places." Chloe nodded, not trusting her voice yet. The buffalo coat was warm, but inside she felt frozen with uncertainty. What kind of man would spend $20 silver to buy a stranger? What did he want from her? As if reading her thoughts, Kent spoke again, his voice low and steady over the creak of the wagon wheels. "You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. No one will harm you there." The simple statement, spoken without drama or expectation, loosened something in Chloe's chest. She found herself able to breathe a little easier as they left the lights of Silver Creek behind. Snow continued to fall as they made their way into the foothills, the wagon swaying gently over the rutted road. Kent kept his attention on the horses, giving Chloe space to gather her thoughts. The full moon occasionally broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of silver. "Thank you," she finally whispered, the words barely audible above the wind and the horses' hooves. "For stopping them." She couldn't finish. Kent nodded once, his profile stern in the moonlight. "No man should treat his daughter so," he said, "or any woman that way." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not filled with fear, but with the possibility of understanding. As they climbed higher into the hills, Chloe found herself studying her unlikely rescuer. His hands on the reins were sure and steady, his shoulders set against the wind. Whatever had driven him to intervene tonight, she sensed it came from a place of justice rather than pity. The snow was falling lighter by the time Kent turned the wagon onto a narrower trail. Through the trees, Chloe caught glimpses of a cabin ahead, smoke rising from its stone chimney. A dog's bark echoed through the night, and a lantern suddenly flared to life on the cabin's porch. "Home," Kent said simply, drawing the horses to a halt. The word hung in the air between them, filled with questions neither of them was ready to answer. But as Chloe looked at the warm light spilling from the cabin windows, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel after the events of this terrible night. Hope. The main street of Silver Creek lay blanketed in fresh snow, the flakes still falling thick and steady in the January night. Lamplight from the saloon windows cast yellow squares across the pristine white, while somewhere in the distance, a dog howled at the mounting storm. Kent McKenna's towering form cast a long shadow as he led Chloe May toward his waiting sled. The mules stamped their hooves impatiently, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. They were stout, sturdy animals, well-suited to mountain travel, their harnesses adorned with small brass bells that tinkled softly with each movement. The wooden sled behind them was built for hauling supplies and furs, but Kent had lined the back with fresh straw and woolen blankets. "Here." Kent's voice was low and gruff as he gestured toward the sled. His words came out clipped, as if he wasn't used to speaking much at all. Chloe pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers trembling from more than just the cold. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. She was about to journey into the wilderness with a man she barely knew, a man the townsfolk called Mad McKenna in whispered tones. What fate awaited her in those dark mountains? Kent's massive hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped her onto the sled, making sure she was settled among the blankets before taking his place at the front. The reins cracked once, and the mules lurched forward, their bells creating a lonely melody that echoed through the empty street. They left Silver Creek behind, without a backward glance, the sled runners cutting clean tracks through the unmarked snow. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the rhythmic crunching of the mules' hooves and the occasional creak of the wooden sled. In the distance, wolves began their nightly chorus, their haunting calls making Chloe draw the blankets closer. The trail wound steadily upward through stands of pine and aspen. Snow-laden branches loomed overhead, occasionally dropping their heavy burden with a soft thump. Kent sat like a statue, his broad shoulders squared against the wind, saying nothing. But Chloe noticed how he would occasionally glance back, checking on her, and how he slowed the mule's pace when the trail grew rough. After what seemed like hours, they crested a ridge, and Kent's cabin came into view. It was larger than Chloe had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that sent sparks dancing up into the night sky. A thin thread of smoke promised warmth within, and a single lantern burned in the window like a beacon. The sled came to a stop near the cabin's front steps. Kent jumped down and moved to help Chloe, his hand spanning her waist as he lifted her from the sled, as easily as if she were a child. The gentle care in his touch startled her. This was not the rough handling she had feared from such a forbidding man. "Watch your step," he murmured, steadying her as she found her footing in the deep snow. "Ice under there." The cabin door opened with a creak, releasing a wave of blessed warmth. A fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The interior was simple but solid: a plank table, several chairs, shelves lined with provisions, and bunks built into the far wall. Everything spoke of utility rather than comfort, yet there was something welcoming about the space. Kent moved to the fire, where a pot hung simmering. He ladled something into a tin bowl and placed it on the table, along with a spoon and a thick slice of dark bread. "Eat," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Chloe hesitated, her stomach growling at the rich smell of the stew, but uncertainty held her back. Kent seemed to understand her hesitation. He stepped away from the table, giving her space, and busied himself with hanging up his coat. Finally, hunger won out over fear. Chloe sat and took a cautious spoonful of the stew. It was surprisingly good: tender venison and root vegetables in a hearty broth. Before she knew it, she was eating with real appetite, sopping up the last bits with the bread. The fire popped and crackled in the silence. Kent had settled into a chair by the hearth, his presence somehow less intimidating now that they were in the warm light of his home. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough but kind. "No woman should be sold like cattle," he said, looking into the flames rather than at her. "Not by her own father. Not by anyone." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You can stay here, get your strength back. Then, if you wish, go your own way. The choice will be yours." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes and spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. This man, whom townsfolk whispered was more savage than civilized, was offering her something she'd never truly had before: safety and the freedom to choose her own path. As she wiped her eyes with trembling fingers, Chloe began to notice details about the cabin she'd missed before. The hearth needed sweeping, with ashes scattered on the stones. Dishes were stacked haphazardly on a shelf, and the windows wore a layer of dust. But most striking was the silence, a deep, settled quiet that spoke of long solitude. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her, the events of the day catching up all at once. The fire's warmth seemed to seep into her bones, making her eyelids heavy. Without really meaning to, she found herself curling up in the chair, drawing her feet up beneath her skirts. Kent rose silently and fetched another blanket, draping it over her with the same careful gentleness he'd shown before. Then he retrieved his rifle from its pegs on the wall and settled back in his chair, the weapon across his knees. He said nothing more, but his presence felt protective rather than threatening as he kept his quiet vigil. The fire's light played across his weathered features as Chloe's eyes grew heavier. His expression was distant, lost in thoughts she couldn't guess at, but there was something reassuring in the way he sat, steady and watchful, like a guardian through the long night ahead. The last thing Chloe saw before sleep claimed her was Kent adding another log to the fire, his movements measured and quiet, as if taking care not to disturb her rest. The flames caught and crackled, sending warmth and light dancing through the cabin, and for the first time since her father had dragged her to that terrible auction, Chloe felt truly safe. Morning crept into the cabin like a shy visitor. Pale sunlight filtered through the frost-rimmed windows, creating delicate patterns on the rough-hewn floor. Chloe stirred from her place by the hearth, where she had slept deeper than she had in months, wrapped in the woolen blanket Kent had given her. The aroma of coffee filled the air, rich and inviting. Kent stood at the iron stove, his broad back turned to her as he worked the coffee pot. He had already stoked the fire back to life, and warmth had chased away the night's chill. "Thank you," Chloe said softly, pulling herself up straighter in the chair. "For everything." Kent turned slightly, giving a single nod of acknowledgement. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, setting one before her without ceremony. The morning light revealed more of the cabin's state than she had seen the night before. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped the ceiling corners like tattered lace. As they shared a simple breakfast of salt pork and the remains of yesterday's bread, Chloe's eyes fell on a pile of clothes near Kent's bunk. Shirts with torn sleeves and missing buttons lay in a heap, and nearby she spotted several fur traps with broken chains. "I could mend those for you," she offered, her voice still timid but steady. "The shirts, I mean. And I know something about fixing traps, too. My uncle was a trapper before he passed." Kent glanced up from his coffee, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Needn't trouble yourself," he muttered, but his eyes lingered on the pile of clothes. "It's no trouble," Chloe insisted gently. "It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Kent shifted in his chair, unused to such offers. After a long moment, he gave another of his slight nods, and Chloe took it as permission to begin. As the morning wore on, she discovered just how much Kent's cabin was more tool shed than home. Unwashed pans were stacked in corners, their surfaces dulled with grease. 2 chairs stood with broken legs propped against the wall, and the shelves held little besides strips of dried venison and basic supplies. The whole space spoke of survival rather than living. Chloe found needle and thread in her pocket, a habit from years of mending her own clothes. She settled near the window where the light was best, and began working on Kent's shirts. As she sewed, she hummed softly, old hymns her mother had taught her before she died. Kent moved about the cabin, cleaning his rifle and checking his gear. At first he seemed uneasy with the quiet melody, his shoulders tense. But as the morning passed into afternoon, she noticed him relax, the rigid set of his back softening just slightly. While the shirts dried near the fire after washing, Chloe turned her attention to the cabin itself. She found a broom in a corner and began sweeping, working her way from the hearth outward. The physical labor felt good after so many months of being told she was too big, too clumsy for such work. Kent watched her from the corner of his eye as he worked on his traps at the table. He said nothing to stop her, and Chloe took that as permission to continue. She discovered a sack of flour tucked away on a high shelf, still good despite its age. The idea of fresh biscuits made her mouth water, and she set to work. The familiar motions of mixing and kneading dough brought comfort. She had learned at her mother's knee, back when their farm kitchen had been filled with warmth and love instead of her father's bitter words. As she worked, she continued humming, the old songs rising naturally to her lips. By supper time, the cabin had transformed. Clean windows let in more light, the floor was swept, and the shelves were organized. The scent of baking biscuits filled the space, making it feel more like a home than a mere shelter against the wilderness. Kent returned from chopping wood outside, stopping short at the doorway. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the changes. For a moment, Chloe feared she had overstepped, but then she saw something soften in his expression. She placed a plate of golden biscuits on the table beside the venison stew she had heated. Kent sat down slowly, as if unsure how to handle such attention. He took a biscuit, broke it open, and ate in his usual silence. Then he set his coffee cup down with unusual firmness. "Better than I've had in years," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Chloe felt warmth bloom in her chest at the simple praise. After they finished eating, she cleaned up while Kent banked the fire for the night. The evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket, the cabin now feeling more welcoming than it had the night before. When the last dish was dried and put away, Chloe knelt beside her cot. The words of Scripture came easily, prayers she had whispered countless times before. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Her voice was gentle but steady in the fire-lit quiet. Kent sat in his chair, staring into the flames as she prayed. Though he remained silent, she could sense him listening. His expression was distant, haunted perhaps by memories she couldn't guess at, yet something in his posture suggested he found a strange comfort in her words of faith. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls of the cabin that now felt less like a stranger's shelter and more like it could, perhaps, become a true home. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, warmth and order had begun to take root, where before there had been only solitude and bare survival. Days slipped by like snowflakes, each one settling into a gentle rhythm at Kent McKenna's cabin. The routine emerged naturally, as if the wilderness itself had ordained their roles. Morning brought the crack of Kent's axe against wood, while inside, Chloe stirred porridge and hung freshly washed clothes near the hearth to dry. The cabin transformed with each passing day. Chloe's touch appeared in small ways. A shelf reorganized, a floor swept smooth, a pile of mended clothes folded neatly. Kent noticed these changes but spoke little, though his eyes often followed her movements as she worked, a question growing in their depths. On this particular afternoon, snow fell in thick curtains outside the frost-laced windows. Chloe sat in the chair nearest the fire, her nimble fingers working at darning Kent's wool socks. The steady motion of her needle brought comfort, a task she'd done countless times before. Kent had gone to check his trap lines but would return soon. He always did, as regular as the sun setting. The door creaked open, bringing a swirl of snow and Kent's towering frame. He stamped his boots, shrugging off his heavy coat. His eyes fell on Chloe, as they often did now, with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, unspoken. "Found tracks," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Beaver, maybe. Need to check the ledger, see what pelts fetch these days." Chloe's hands stilled over her mending. She drew a careful breath, gathering courage. "I could help with that," she offered softly. "I can read and write, numbers too." Kent turned sharply, surprise evident in his usually stoic features. "You can read?" She nodded, fingers twisting in her lap. "My mama taught me, before she passed. Said knowledge was worth more than gold out here on the frontier." Papa. She swallowed hard. Papa said it was useless for a girl like me, but I kept at it in secret. Kent stood very still, studying her with new eyes. Without a word, he crossed to a shelf and pulled down a worn leather ledger. Dust coated its surface. Clearly, it hadn't been opened in some time. He placed it before her, almost like a test. Chloe opened the book carefully. Pages of scrawled numbers and half-finished calculations spread before her. She reached for the pencil Kent offered, her hand steady despite her nervousness. "These figures here," she said, pointing to a column, "they don't add up, right? The trader in Silver Creek, he's been shorting you on your pelts." Her finger traced down the page. "See here? And here? You're owed at least $50 more than what's written." Kent leaned over her shoulder, his presence solid and warm. His breath caught as she explained each calculation, her neat figures appearing alongside his messy scrawl. She showed him how to track expenses against earnings, how to calculate profit properly. "Been cheated," he muttered, shaking his head. "All this time." "Most traders count on trappers not knowing their numbers," Chloe explained. "My uncle taught me that before he died. Said a man's fortune could disappear in bad arithmetic." Kent pulled up a chair beside her, watching as she balanced his accounts with careful precision. Her handwriting flowed across the page, clear and confident. This was a language she knew well, one that had nothing to do with her size or what others thought of her. "You've been underestimated," Kent said finally, his voice low and intense. "Your whole life." Chloe's hand trembled slightly at his words. No one had ever seen her this way before, as someone with value beyond her appearance. She continued working, letting the familiar comfort of numbers steady her nerves. As evening approached, Chloe moved to the stove, where a pot of venison stew simmered. The ledger work had stirred something in her soul, a reminder that she was more than what her father had claimed. Almost without thinking, she began to sing, an old hymn rising naturally to her lips. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The melody filled the cabin, pure and clear as spring water. Kent had stepped outside to bring in more firewood. He paused at the doorway, his arms full of split logs, listening as Chloe's voice drifted into the cold night air. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a loosening of his usually rigid jaw. The song seemed to reach past his careful defenses, thawing something long frozen in his chest. Inside, Chloe stirred the stew, unaware of her audience. The hymn continued, carried on her gentle voice. "I once was lost, but now am found." The words held special meaning now, here in this cabin where she had found unexpected sanctuary. Kent entered quietly, setting the wood beside the hearth. The lamplight cast soft shadows across the walls as evening settled in. Chloe served the stew in their usual companionable silence, but something had changed between them, a shift as subtle as spring beneath winter snow. Later, as the fire burned low and night pressed against the windows, Chloe gathered her courage once more. "I want to thank you," she said softly, pulling her shawl closer around her shoulders. "For not treating me like a burden. For seeing me as—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the dignity she'd found in his cabin. Kent cleared his throat, his hands rough against the wooden table. "You carry more worth than you know," he said, the words coming slow but sure. Chloe felt heat rise in her cheeks. She clutched her shawl tighter, her heart beating quick and uncertain at his words. How strange that here, in this remote cabin with this quiet giant of a man, she had found someone who saw her true value. She ducked her head, unable to meet his intense gaze, yet feeling warmed by it all the same. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them with its gentle song. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, while inside, something new and fragile grew in the space between two lonely hearts. A week passed, like water flowing beneath winter ice, quiet on the surface, but moving steadily beneath. The morning dawned bitter cold, frost patterns decorating the cabin windows like delicate lace. Chloe wrapped her thick shawl tightly around her shoulders as she made her way down the snowy path to the creek, 2 wooden buckets swinging from her arms. Kent had carved steps into the steep bank, making her daily water gathering safer. The creek whispered beneath a sheet of ice, its voice muffled by winter's grip. Chloe knelt at the hole Kent had chopped that morning, dipping her first bucket carefully. The water was so cold it made her fingers ache, even through her woolen mittens. Heavy footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Kent appeared, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the ice. He'd taken to following her at a distance during her chores, watching over her like a silent guardian. Today, something in his presence gave her courage to speak the truth she'd been holding close. "There's something I need to tell you," Chloe said softly, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She set the full bucket aside and began filling the second one, keeping her eyes on the dark water. "About why my father," her voice caught. "About why he was so eager to sell me that night." Kent said nothing, but she felt his attention sharpen. He moved closer, boots creaking in the packed snow. "The debt wasn't just for whiskey," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He owed money to railroad men. Powerful ones." The bucket filled, and she set it beside the first. "They want our land. My land, really. Mama left it to me in her will." Kent's shadow didn't move. He waited, patient as the mountains themselves, for her to continue. "There's a spring on that property," Chloe explained, finally looking up at him. "The only reliable one for miles around. In summer, when other creeks run dry, it keeps flowing strong and sweet." Her fingers twisted in her shawl. "The railroad needs water for their steam engines. They've been trying to buy the land for 2 years, offering less than it's worth. When I refused to sell, they started pressuring Papa instead." A muscle twitched in Kent's jaw. He knew the type, men in fine suits who carried death in their pockets just as surely as any outlaw. Men who used papers and promises to steal what guns couldn't take. "They won't let me go," Chloe said, her voice strengthening with determination despite her fear. "Not while I hold that deed. Papa thought if he got rid of me, they'd pay off his debts and take the land anyway." Tears froze on her cheeks. "I reckon they'll come looking soon enough." Kent's massive hands clenched into fists. Without a word, he lifted both water buckets and started back toward the cabin. Chloe followed, her boots leaving smaller tracks beside his large ones in the fresh snow. Inside the cabin's warmth, Kent set the buckets down carefully. He moved to the gun rack with deliberate slowness, taking down his Winchester rifle. The familiar motions of loading cartridges seemed to calm him as he worked, though his expression remained dark. "Trouble's coming," he muttered, sliding each brass cartridge into place with a solid click. "Men like that don't give up easy." Chloe stood by the hearth, wringing her hands. "I don't want any bloodshed," she said firmly. "There's been too much of that already in these mountains. Too many men thinking bullets solve everything." Kent's hands stilled on the rifle. He looked at her then, really looked, seeing not just a woman he'd saved from humiliation, but someone with her own kind of strength. A strength that had nothing to do with weapons or violence. "They'll not take you easy," he promised, his voice rough but gentle. "Not while I draw breath." He set the rifle aside, but within easy reach, a compromise between preparation and peace. Evening drew in early, as it did in winter. Wind began to howl around the cabin corners, rattling the shutters Kent had hung last summer. Chloe lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness. She moved about her evening routine, stirring the stew, laying out bowls, checking the fire. But her movements were slower, weighted with worry. After their simple supper, while Kent whittled by the fire, Chloe knelt beside her cot. Her voice rose clear and steady in prayer, barely trembling despite her fears. Lord, protect us in these coming days. Guide our paths toward justice without violence. Give us wisdom to find a way through this valley of shadows. Kent's knife stilled in his hands. He watched her, this woman who faced danger with prayers instead of bullets. His own life had been carved by violence, first in the war, then in the wilderness where only the strong survived. But something in her quiet faith stirred memories of his mother's teachings, long buried under years of hard living. The fire crackled softly as Chloe continued praying. Kent found himself listening intently, not to the words themselves, but to the peace in her voice. His hands, calloused from years of trapping and fighting, felt suddenly heavy. Violence had always been his answer, his first and sometimes only tool. But watching Chloe, seeing her quiet strength, he wondered if there might be another way. She finished her prayers and rose gracefully despite her size, brushing off her skirts. Her eyes met his across the fire-lit room, and he saw no weakness there, only determination and hope. This woman, who had every right to be bitter about how life had treated her, still chose faith over fear, mercy over vengeance. Kent turned back to his whittling, but his thoughts remained on Chloe's words. The railroad men would come, that was certain as sunrise. His instincts screamed to meet force with force, to protect what was his. And somewhere in these past weeks, Chloe had become his to protect. But perhaps she could teach him something about fighting battles with wisdom instead of weapons. The wind continued its lonely song outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of strength was taking root. Kent watched Chloe prepare for bed, her movements sure and peaceful, despite the threats gathering like storm clouds on their horizon. He knew then that whatever came next would test not just his strength, but his ability to find new ways to face old problems. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the log walls. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight, in this warm circle of lamplight, Kent McKenna began to understand that true courage might look different than he'd always thought. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale strokes of pink and gold. Kent stood on his cabin's porch, watching frost sparkle on bare branches, while waiting for Chloe to finish her morning prayers. When she emerged, wrapped warmly in her shawl, he gestured for her to follow him around back where he'd set up wooden targets. "Time you learned to protect yourself," he said gruffly, lifting his old Spencer carbine from its leather scabbard. The rifle was lighter than his Winchester, better suited for someone learning to shoot. Chloe's eyes widened. "I never held a gun before," she admitted, studying the weapon with equal parts fascination and apprehension. "Then it's past time." Kent checked the rifle's action, making sure it was clean and oiled. "Railroad men won't care that you're gentle-natured. Need to know you can stand your ground if trouble comes." He showed her how to load the cartridges, explaining each step with patience he didn't know he possessed. Chloe listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration as her fingers traced the mechanisms he pointed out. "Now," Kent said, moving behind her, "stand like this." He positioned her feet shoulder-width apart, then guided the rifle to her shoulder. His large hands engulfed hers as he showed her how to grip the stock and rest her cheek against it properly. "Breathe steady. Line up the sights with that notched log yonder." Chloe trembled slightly, whether from the cold or nervousness, he couldn't tell. Her hair smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke, and Kent found himself suddenly aware of how close they stood. He stepped back slightly, keeping one hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Squeeze gentle," he instructed. "Don't pull." The rifle cracked. Chloe yelped as the recoil jolted her shoulder, but her shot struck the log, sending splinters flying. Kent nodded approvingly. "Good." Again. They spent the next hour practicing. Chloe's aim improved with each shot, though she never quite got used to the recoil. Her determination impressed Kent more than her accuracy, She didn't complain once about her bruising shoulder or cold fingers. When the morning grew later, Kent led her to the stable where he kept his horses. His mare Duchess stood in one stall, while in the other, a smaller brown mare named Pearl dozed in the hay. "Riding's next," he announced. "Can't always count on having a wagon or sled. Need to know you can make distance if you have to." Chloe approached Pearl cautiously. "She seems gentle enough." "Gentlest horse I ever broke," Kent confirmed, showing her how to brush the mare down. He demonstrated each step of saddling, blanket, cinch, bridle, explaining as he went. Chloe's fingers proved nimble with the buckles, though she struggled with the saddle's weight. Getting her mounted proved another challenge entirely. Despite her best efforts to use the stirrup properly, her first attempt ended with her sliding straight over Pearl's other side into a snowdrift. Kent started forward to help, but Chloe's laughter stopped him. She sat up, snow dusting her hair and clothes, giggling at her own clumsiness. The sound startled him. Laughter was rare in his world of solitude and survival. Without meaning to, Kent found himself chuckling, a rusty sound that surprised them both. He quickly schooled his features back to sternness, but something in his chest had loosened at her mirth. "Try again," he said, offering his hand. This time he helped boost her up, and she managed to settle in the saddle, looking pleased despite her reddened cheeks. "Now what?" she asked, gripping the reins tightly. "Relax your hands," Kent instructed. "Horse can feel your nerves." "Sit straight but easy, like you're part of her." He led Pearl in a circle, showing Chloe how to move with the horse's gait. After several rounds, he let her take control. The morning passed in slow circles and careful instruction. Chloe fell twice more, but always got back up determined. By afternoon, she had mastered walking and was ready to try trotting. Kent kept close, ready to grab Pearl's reins if needed, but Chloe handled the increased speed well. As evening approached, Chloe managed to guide Pearl in a full trot around the snow-packed clearing. Her face glowed with triumph as she finally pulled the mare to a stop near the cabin. Kent helped her dismount, noting how her legs trembled from hours in the saddle. "You done good," he said simply, leading Pearl back to the stable. Inside the cabin, Chloe moved stiffly as she prepared their supper. The familiar routine of cooking seemed to ease her aches, and soon the cabin filled with the savory smell of bean soup and cornbread. They ate in comfortable silence until Chloe spoke softly. "Thank you, Kent." She met his eyes across the table. "You're giving me more than just a roof over my head. You're giving me a future, a chance to stand on my own 2 feet." Her voice carried such earnest gratitude that Kent had to look away, staring into his soup bowl as warmth spread through his chest. Words failed him, as they often did when feelings ran deep. He managed a grunt of acknowledgement, but Chloe seemed to understand what he couldn't express. She smiled and returned to her meal, leaving him to wrestle with emotions he'd long thought buried. As night settled over the mountains, they sat by the fire in what had become their evening ritual. Chloe worked on mending while Kent cleaned his guns, but something had shifted between them. The silence felt different, warmer, more companionable. Every so often, Kent would glance at her, watching how the firelight played across her features as she concentrated on her stitching. She'd changed since that night at the livery stable. The fearful, shame-faced girl was giving way to someone stronger, someone who could shoot straight and ride proud. Yet she hadn't lost her gentleness. It showed in how she handled Pearl, how she treated his rough cabin with care, how she still knelt in prayer each night. The fire crackled peacefully, sending shadows dancing on log walls. Outside, wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. But here in this circle of warmth and lamplight, Kent felt something taking root that he hadn't expected, something that made his solitary life seem suddenly incomplete without Chloe's presence. She looked up from her mending and caught him watching her, Instead of turning away embarrassed, she offered a small smile that reached her eyes. Kent found himself nodding in response, acknowledging this unspoken thing growing between them. This trust, this affection, this partnership forming day by day like spring thaw softening winter ground. They stayed like that as evening deepened, sharing quiet peace by the fire, each lost in their own thoughts but bound together by something stronger than words could express. Snow crunched under the horses' hooves as Kent and Chloe made their way down the winding mountain trail toward Silver Creek. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine white drifts, and their breath fogged in the crisp winter air. Kent's sled, loaded with carefully bundled furs and pelts, glided smoothly behind them. Chloe sat straight-backed on Pearl, trying to remember Kent's lessons about riding with confidence. Still, her stomach tightened as the first buildings of Silver Creek came into view. She hadn't been back to town since that terrible night at the livery stable. "You don't have to come in," Kent said gruffly, noticing her tension. "Could wait with the horses?" "No." Chloe squared her shoulders. "I won't hide." Kent nodded once, approval flickering in his eyes. They rode side by side down the main street, past the saloon where her father had drunk away their money, past the livery stable where he'd tried to sell her. Chloe felt the weight of stairs following them. "Look there," a woman's voice carried clearly. "That's the fat one old McKenna bought." "Reckon he got his money's worth?" Another answered with a snicker. "She's still just as big." Heat crept up Chloe's neck, but she lifted her chin higher, focusing on the steady rhythm of Pearl's steps. Beside her, Kent's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. They dismounted outside the mercantile, tying their horses to the hitching post. Kent began unloading bundles of furs while Chloe gathered her courage. The store bell jingled as they entered. Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger. His eyebrows rose at the sight of them together. "McKenna," he acknowledged, then hesitated before adding, "Miss May." "Brought furs to trade?" Kent said shortly, laying his bundles on the counter. Mr. Peterson began sorting through the pelts, calling out prices. "Beaver, prime condition, $2. Mink, $1.50. Fox Dash." "That's not right," Chloe spoke up quietly but firmly. Both men turned to look at her. "The posted price for prime beaver is $2.50, and that mink is worth at least $2 given the quality." Mr. Peterson blinked, surprised. "Well, now you know your prices, Miss May." "I can figure sums," she said, moving closer to the counter. "Shall we calculate the total?" The storekeeper pushed his ledger toward her, a challenge in his eyes. Chloe picked up his pencil and began working down the column of numbers, her neat figures marching precisely across the page. Her mind worked quickly, adding values faster than Mr. Peterson could check them. $37.25 total, she announced, less the cost of supplies we need. Mr. Peterson verified her calculations twice, his expression shifting from skepticism to respect. "Right to the penny," he admitted. "Where'd you learn figures like that?" "My mother taught me before she passed," Chloe explained. "Said a woman needs to know her sums to avoid being cheated." A ghost of a smile crossed Kent's face as he watched the storekeeper's growing admiration. They began selecting supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, with Chloe keeping careful track of the expenses. The store bell rang again. A man stumbled in, reeking of whiskey. "Well, if it ain't McKenna's purchased woman," he slurred. "Still eating him out of house and home?" Kent moved with startling speed for such a big man. In 2 strides, he placed himself between Chloe and the drunk, his massive frame blocking the man's view. He didn't speak, just fixed the drunk with a steel-cold glare that promised violence. The drunk's courage withered. He backed toward the door, muttering, "Just making conversation is all." "Make it elsewhere," Kent growled. The drunk fled. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "I'll have my boy help load your supplies." He called out back, and a young half-Apache boy named Thomas appeared. Chloe recognized him from church services. As they carried goods out to the sled, Thomas smiled shyly at Chloe. "I remember you, Miss May. You sang Amazing Grace real pretty in church last summer. My ma said it reminded her of the songs her people sing." "Thank you, Thomas," Chloe replied warmly. "That's kind of you to say." They were securing the last bundles when Mrs. Roberts, the preacher's wife, hurried across the street. She carried a cloth-wrapped package that steamed in the cold air. "Chloe May," she called out, "I thought that was you." "I've just taken fresh bread from the oven." She pressed the warm package into Chloe's hands. "You poor dear. I've been worried about you since that dreadful night. Are you being treated well?" Her eyes darted uncertainly to Kent. "Very well, Mrs. Roberts," Chloe assured her. "Mr. McKenna has been nothing but kind." The preacher's wife studied them both, then nodded, apparently satisfied by what she saw. "You're always welcome at services," she said. "Both of you," she added, including Kent in her smile. More townspeople passed by as they finished loading. Some still whispered and stared, but others offered cautious greetings. Thomas waved goodbye, and Mr. Peterson called out from his doorway, "Come back soon, Miss May. Could use your help with the books sometime." Chloe felt warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with Mrs. Roberts' bread. For the first time since that horrible auction night, she saw a possibility in these familiar streets, the chance to be known for her mind rather than her size, to be valued rather than scorned. Kent helped her mount Pearl, his strong hands steady at her waist. As they rode out of town, the setting sun painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. Chloe broke the comfortable silence between them. "Maybe," she said softly. "Not everyone despises me after all." Kent's eyes remained on the trail ahead, but his deep voice carried clearly. "They'd be fools if they did." Chloe ducked her head to hide her smile, but warmth bloomed in her chest at his words. The horses' hooves marked steady rhythm in the snow as they made their way home, the town's whispers fading behind them. Kent rode beside her, a solid presence against the gathering dusk. Though he said nothing more, his quiet support spoke volumes. In the short week since that desperate night at the livery stable, he had shown her more kindness than she'd known in years. Now, watching him guide his horse along the familiar trail, Chloe realized that his gruff exterior hid a gentle heart, one that had recognized her worth when she'd forgotten it herself. The mountain air grew sharper as they climbed, and Chloe pulled her shawl tighter. But despite the cold, she felt warmer than she had in a long time. Today had shown her that change was possible, in how others saw her and how she saw herself. And beside her rode the man who had made it all possible, who had given her not just shelter, but the chance to discover her own strength. The mountain winter loosened its grip as March drew near. Patches of bare earth emerged from beneath melting snow, and morning birdsong replaced the hollow whistle of winter wind. Inside Kent's cabin, spring's promise of renewal had already taken root. Chloe stood at the newly scrubbed window, adjusting the curtains she'd stitched from feed sacks. She'd carefully bleached the fabric and embroidered simple pine branches along the edges. Afternoon light filtered through them, casting gentle patterns across the swept floor. The cabin had transformed under her care. Gone were the cobwebs and scattered tools. Now dried herbs hung in tidy bundles from the rafters. Kent's trap repair supplies occupied labeled shelves, rather than cluttering every surface. Even his collection of pelts lay neatly sorted and ready for market. Outside, the woodpile stood precisely stacked, each log split and arranged by size. Kent had shown her how to identify the best burning woods, and she'd organized them accordingly. The sight brought a small smile to her face. He'd grumbled at first about her fussing, but she'd caught him admiring the orderly rows more than once. The door creaked open, and Kent ducked his tall frame through, bringing the sharp scent of pine with him. "Stew's ready," Chloe called, moving to the hearth where the iron pot bubbled. She ladled generous portions into their bowls, simple tin when she'd arrived, now scrubbed to a shine. They settled into their usual places at the table Kent had mended. The wobbly leg no longer needed a wedge of wood to stay steady. Chloe had even managed to smooth down the rough spots that once caught at clothes and skin. "Tell me about that bear again," she said as they ate. "The one that followed you 3 days through Blacktail Canyon." Kent's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, his version of a smile. "Meanest old grizzly I ever met," he began, his deep voice warming to the tale. "Tracked me clear from the river, mad as sin about me stumbling on her fishing spot." Chloe leaned forward, though she'd heard the story before. She loved watching him come alive in the telling, his usual terseness falling away. His hands moved as he described the cat and mouse game through the canyon, demonstrating how he'd finally outsmarted the bear by doubling back through a narrow cave passage. "What about you?" he asked when he'd finished. "Any more stories about them books your ma taught you from?" "She loved the Psalms best," Chloe replied softly. "Even when she was too weak to leave her bed that last winter, she'd have me read them. Said they reminded her that beauty exists even in hard times." She paused, remembering. Her favorite was Psalm 23. She'd close her eyes and smile when I got to the part about still waters. Kent nodded, understanding in his silence. They finished their meal, comfortable in the quiet that had grown between them over these months. Later that afternoon, Kent suggested a ride to check the valley's condition as the snow retreated. Chloe readily agreed. She'd grown confident on horseback under his patient teaching, and Pearl, the mare he'd given her to ride, responded to her touch like an old friend. They rode side by side along the ridge trail, hooves crunching through patches of lingering snow. The air held the fresh, wet scent of thaw, and new grass sprouted in sunny spots. Kent led them down a winding path into the valley below. "There," he said finally, pointing ahead. "That's the spring they're after." Chloe reined Pearl to a stop beside Kent's stallion. The spring bubbled up from between rocks, forming a clear pool before flowing into a steady stream. Even in the depths of winter, she knew, this spring never froze. "Ma used to say it was God's gift," she said quietly. "When other creeks ran dry in summer, this one kept flowing, kept our stock alive more than once." Kent dismounted and helped her down, his strong hands gentle at her waist. They walked to the spring's edge and settled on sun-warmed rocks. Water music filled the air, the soft splash of the spring, the gurgle of the stream, the drip of melting snow from nearby branches. Time slipped past unmarked. Chloe watched fish dart in the pool's depths, while Kent cleaned his pipe, neither feeling the need to break the peaceful silence. The afternoon light softened, painting the valley in gold. Finally, they rode back as dusk approached. The cabin windows glowed warmly in welcome, smoke curling from the chimney where Chloe had banked the morning's fire. Inside, Kent built the flame back up, while she prepared a light supper of bread and dried venison. They sat before the hearth afterward, as had become their custom. The fire popped and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Chloe watched the flames, gathering her courage to speak the words that had been building in her heart. "Kent," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned toward her, firelight reflected in his eyes. "I need you to know something. That night at the livery, you didn't just buy me. You gave me back my life." Kent went very still, like a man who's spotted sudden movement in the brush. His hands, usually so steady, tightened on his pipe. "Before," she continued, "I was just the fat girl, worthless except for the land I'd inherited. But you," she swallowed hard, "you gave me safety. Showed me I had value beyond what others saw. Taught me to be strong." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the fire's soft voice. Kent's chest rose and fell with careful breaths. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, he spoke. "You've given me mine, too. The words seemed pulled from deep inside him, like water from a hidden well. His calloused hand moved slightly toward hers, where it rested on the bench between them, then withdrew. This place, he gestured at the cabin, wasn't really a home before. Just somewhere to sleep between hunts. Now. He cleared his throat. Now it's different. Chloe's heart thundered in her chest. She watched his profile, stern and weathered in the firelight, seeing the vulnerability beneath his usual stoic expression. This man, who had faced down grizzlies and survived wilderness winters alone, looked almost afraid of the feeling building between them. The fire settled, sending up a shower of sparks. Neither moved to add more wood. They sat side by side in the growing darkness, inches apart, yet aware of each other like thunder aware of lightning. The line between protector and protected had blurred, transformed into something deeper, something that made Chloe's breath catch and Kent's hands tremble slightly as he tamped out his pipe. Embers glowed in the hearth, their light touching Chloe's face softly, catching in her hair. Kent found himself studying her in these quiet moments. Not her size, which had never mattered to him, but the quiet strength in her features, the kindness in her eyes, the way her presence had filled empty spaces in his life he hadn't even known were there. They remained there as the fire dimmed, each lost in thought, yet profoundly aware of the other, their shared silence holding more meaning than words could express. The evening wrapped around them like a blanket, warm with unspoken love and the promise of tomorrow's dawn. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Kent pulled on his heavy coat. The morning air held the crisp bite of late winter, though signs of spring had begun appearing in sheltered hollows. He paused at the door, watching Chloe knead bread dough at the table, her movements sure and practiced. Flour dusted her arms, and she hummed an old hymn that filled the cabin with warmth. "Won't be gone long," he said, checking his rifle. "Just need to check the line of traps in Thunder Valley." Chloe looked up, smiling. "I'll have fresh bread waiting when you return." Her fingers worked the dough with confident strokes. "And maybe some of that berry preserve we put up last week." Kent nodded, his expression softening as he watched her work. The sight of her there, making his cabin into a home, still struck him as a miracle some mornings. He shouldered his rifle and stepped out into the pearl-gray dawn. The snap of twigs should have warned him, but the crack of a branch came too late as two men burst from behind the woodpile. Kent swung his rifle around, but a third man emerged from the shadows of a pine, weapon already aimed. "Drop it, mountain man," the stranger growled. Kent's finger tightened on the trigger, calculating odds, but before he could act, something hard slammed into the back of his head. Stars exploded across his vision as he stumbled forward. His rifle clattered to the frozen ground. Inside the cabin, Chloe's hand stilled in the dough as bootsteps thundered on the porch. The door burst inward with a crash that sent splinters flying. 3 men filled the doorway, their faces hard beneath pulled low hats. "Well, well," the tallest one drawled. "If it ain't the fat girl who's been causing us so much trouble." Chloe backed away from the table, her heart hammering. She recognized them. Railroad men who'd pressured her father about the spring. The ones who'd helped drive him to drink, to debt, to that terrible night at the livery. "Get out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This isn't your property." The leader laughed, an ugly sound. "That spring land is railroad property now, girl. Your pa signed it over fair and square before he took sick and died last week." The news of her father's death struck like a physical blow, but Chloe forced herself to stand straight. "You're lying. He had no right to sell what was deeded to me." "Shut her up!" the leader snapped. The other men lunged forward. Chloe tried to run, but rough hands seized her arms. She kicked and fought as they bound her wrists with rope. "Kent!" she screamed. "Kent!" They dragged her outside into the biting cold. Snow soaked through her skirts as she struggled. Through tears of fury and fear, she saw Kent on his knees in the yard, blood running down his face. 2 men held him as a third brought a rifle butt down hard across his shoulders. "Kent!" she cried again as they lifted her onto a horse. He tried to surge to his feet, but another blow sent him sprawling in the bloodied snow. "Leave him," the leader ordered. "He ain't worth the bullet." He swung up behind Chloe, pinning her arms. "Let's ride." The last thing Chloe saw was Kent's crumpled form growing smaller as they galloped away. Her screams echoed off the valley walls until distance swallowed them. Kent lay in the snow, fighting waves of darkness that threatened to pull him under. Every breath sent knives of pain through his ribs. He could still hear the fading thunder of hooves, carrying Chloe away from him. The thought of her in their hands drove him to move. Inch by agonizing inch, he crawled toward the cabin. Blood dripped from his face, staining the snow crimson. His vision blurred and swam. It took 3 attempts to grip the doorframe and pull himself upright. Inside, the cabin bore signs of struggle. The table had been knocked askew, spilling flour across the floor like snow. Chloe's half-kneaded bread lay abandoned, her fingerprints still pressed in the dough. The sight made Kent's chest constrict with a pain that had nothing to do with his injuries. He staggered to the table, leaning heavily on its solid bulk, but his legs betrayed him, buckling as another wave of dizziness struck. Kent collapsed to his knees, gasping as broken ribs screamed in protest. A flutter of movement caught his eye. Chloe's Bible lay open on the floor where it had fallen, its pages stirring in the draft from the broken door. Kent's gaze fixed on the exposed verse, the words burning into his mind. "Redeem them that are held in captivity." The weight of failure crushed down on his shoulders, heavier than any blow. He had promised to protect her, had sworn no harm would come to her. Now she was gone, taken by men who valued nothing but money and power. The cabin seemed to mock him with its emptiness. No hymns filled the air, no smell of baking bread, no quiet rustle of Chloe moving about her tasks. The home she had created from his barren shelter felt suddenly cold and lifeless, like a body after the spirit has fled. Kent pressed his forehead against the rough wood of the table, tasting blood and bitter guilt. His breath came in ragged gasps that sent spikes of agony through his chest. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache of knowing he had failed the one person who had brought light back into his darkness. Chloe's last cry still rang in his ears, his name on her lips a plea for help he couldn't answer. The memory of her being dragged away while he lay helpless burned like acid in his gut. The railroad men had left him alive, thinking him beaten. They didn't understand that they had taken everything that mattered. The morning light spilled through the broken door, touching Chloe's abandoned needlework, her neatly arranged herbs hanging from the rafters, the curtains she had sewn to soften the harsh windows. Every detail of the cabin spoke of her presence, making her absence cut deeper. Kent remained slumped against the table, blood slowly dripping onto the flour-dusted floor. The cabin's silence pressed in around him, broken only by his labored breathing and the whisper of Bible pages turning in the wind. Kent drifted in and out of consciousness, each breath a knife in his ribs. Sunlight pierced his closed eyelids, and a cool cloth pressed against his forehead. He tried to sit up, but gentle hands pushed him back. "Stay still, you stubborn mule," a woman's voice commanded. "Those men worked you over something fierce." Kent's eyes fluttered open. Sarah Winters, the widow who ran the small ranch near Thunder Valley, stood over him. Her weathered face creased with concern as she wrung out a blood-stained cloth in a basin. "Found you half dead by Miller's Creek," she explained, dabbing at his temple. "Lucky my boy spotted your tracks in the snow while checking fence lines." Memory crashed back like ice water. "Chloe," Kent rasped, struggling to rise. "They took her. Have to. Have to let me finish bandaging your head before you go getting yourself killed," Sarah cut in firmly. She pressed clean cloth against the gash above his ear, winding it around his head with practiced hands. "The Lord didn't guide me to you just so you could bleed out trying to be a hero." Kent subsided, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. Sarah had buried 2 husbands and raised 3 children alone on this unforgiving land. She wasn't a woman to be argued with. "There," she said, tying off the bandage. "Now tell me what happened. Who's this Chloe?" Kent's throat tightened as he described the morning's attack. His voice grew hoarse, remembering Chloe's screams, the helplessness as they dragged her away. When he finished, Sarah's eyes were bright with tears and righteous anger. "Those railroad vultures," she spat. "They've been circling every water source from here to Mesa Ridge." "But to kidnap a woman?" She shook her head. "There's a special place in hell for men like that." "I failed her," Kent whispered, the words tasting like ashes. "Swore to protect her, and I couldn't even—" "Stop that right now," Sarah ordered. She gripped his hand, surprisingly strong for her small frame. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes we fall so he can show us how to rise again." She knelt beside the bed, bowing her head. "Father in heaven, we lift up this man and the woman he seeks to save. Grant him strength to stand, wisdom to act, and faith to trust in your guidance. Amen." Kent remained silent, but something in his chest loosened at the simple prayer. Sarah's faith, like Chloe's, had an unshakable quality that made him feel both humbled and steadied. "I reckon I know what they're planning," Sarah said, rising. "They'll take her before Judge Caro in Silver Creek. That old snake's been in the railroad's pocket for years. They'll try to void her deed, claim her father sold the spring rights fair and square." Kent pushed himself upright, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. His rifle leaned against the wall, and he reached for it, using it like a cane to stand. The room swayed, but he locked his knees. "Can't let that happen," he growled. Sarah watched him with a mixture of exasperation and approval. "No, we can't. But you'll need more than just bullets this time. You'll need witnesses, testimony, proof of their corruption." She pressed a small flask of whiskey into his hand. "For the pain. Now go. I'll send my boy to spread word among those who still believe in justice." Kent took a careful sip, the liquor burning down his throat. "Much obliged, ma'am." "God go with you," Sarah replied softly. "And Kent? That girl's changed you. I can see it in your eyes. Don't lose that light fighting darkness." Kent nodded once and stepped out into the afternoon sun. His horse, somehow recovered by Sarah's sons, stood saddled and waiting. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body as he mounted, but he forced it down. Chloe needed him. The ride to Silver Creek seemed endless. By the time he reached town, shadows were lengthening across the muddy street. Kent tied his horse outside the church, where lamplight glowed in the windows despite the late hour. Inside, Reverend Matthews looked up from his Bible. His eyes widened at Kent's bandaged head and blood-stained coat. "Good Lord, man! What happened to you?" Kent leaned heavily on a pew, explaining about the attack and Chloe's kidnapping. The preacher's usual gentle expression hardened as he listened. "So they mean to use Caro's court to steal her land," Matthews said grimly. "That explains the notice posted this afternoon. Emergency hearing tomorrow at noon." He stood straighter. "I'll testify. I've witnessed Chloe's character, her honest dealings, and I know things about Caro's, arrangements with certain parties." "Appreciate it, Reverend." Kent shifted painfully. "Need one more favor. That Apache boy who helps around the church. Joseph? Sharp as a tack, that one, and moves quiet as a shadow. Could he carry messages? Rally folks who might stand with us?" Matthews smiled. "He already is." News of Chloe's kidnapping spread fast. Joseph's been running between households all afternoon, gathering supporters. His expression softened. "She touched many hearts here, Kent. More than she knows." Kent nodded, throat tight. The preacher gestured to the altar rail. Would you pray with me, brother? For Chloe's safety and for justice to prevail? Kent hesitated. He hadn't knelt in prayer since the war, since watching friends die in senseless violence. But Chloe's faith had awakened something in him, a hunger for more than just survival. Slowly, painfully, he knelt beside Matthews. The lamplight cast long shadows as his voice, rough with emotion, broke the silence. "Lord," he faltered, then drew a shaky breath. "Lord, give me strength to stand for her, to be the man she believes I am. Please, please keep her safe until I can make this right." Tears he hadn't shed in years burned his eyes. Matthews laid a steadying hand on his shoulder as they prayed in the gathering darkness, asking for wisdom, courage, and mercy. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the day's tracks in soft white. But inside the church, a fire was kindling, hope mixed with determination, faith strengthened by love. Kent rose from his knees changed, no longer just a lone mountain man seeking vengeance, but part of something larger. A community coming together to protect one of their own. Tomorrow would bring its battles. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary, Kent found the strength to believe that light could overcome darkness, that love could defeat greed, that faith could move mountains, or at least move enough hearts to save one precious soul who had taught him how to live again. The railroad men dragged Chloe through Silver Creek's muddy streets, their rough hands digging into her arms. Her feet stumbled over frozen ruts as they hauled her toward the saloon, where a crowd had gathered. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across weathered boardwalks, and the cold air bit through her thin shawl. "Look here, folks!" shouted Thompson, the lead railroad agent. His expensive coat gleamed with brass buttons as he shoved Chloe forward. "This here's the girl claiming rights to Thunder Spring." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone called out, "Ain't she the one the mountain man bought?" "That's right," Thompson sneered, circling Chloe like a wolf. "The fat girl sold by her own daddy. Now she thinks she can keep the railroad from rightful property?" Chloe's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to stand straight. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Your worth comes from above, child, not from men's cruel tongues." Judge Caro emerged from the saloon, his black coat dusted with tobacco. He adjusted his spectacles with soft, manicured hands that had never known honest work. Now, he called, his cultured voice carrying across the crowd. "This is a matter for the court, not street theater." He turned to Thompson with a slight bow. "I trust you have the necessary documentation?" "Right here, Your Honor." Thompson patted his vest pocket. "Proof that old May sold those water rights fair and square before he died." "Very well." Caro raised his voice. "Let it be known, there will be a formal hearing tomorrow at noon in the courthouse. All interested parties may attend." His eyes slid past Chloe as if she were invisible. "Until then, the defendant will be held at the Silver Creek Hotel, under guard." "Under guard?" Chloe found her voice at last. "Am I a criminal, then, for defending my mother's land?" "Silence!" Thompson grabbed her arm again. "You'll speak when spoken to in court." A horse's hoofbeats thundered suddenly down the street. Heads turned as a massive figure emerged through the falling snow. Kent McKenna, sitting tall despite his injuries. Blood had seeped through the crude bandage at his temple, and his face was dark with bruises. But his eyes blazed as he reined his horse to a stop. Whispers raced through the crowd. "The mountain man's back." "Lord above, look at him. Reckon there'll be blood before this is done." Kent's gaze locked with Chloe's. In that moment, she saw past his fearsome appearance to the gentle soul who had given her shelter, taught her to ride, listened to her hymns. Her heart steadied even as Thompson's fingers dug deeper into her arm. "This ain't your concern anymore, McKenna," Thompson called out, but his voice wavered. "The law's handling it now." Kent's hand rested casually on his rifle. The law? His quiet voice carried dangerous undertones. Or whatever's been bought and paid for. Judge Caro stepped forward, shoulders stiff. Mind your words, sir. Any interference with legal proceedings will be dealt with severely. Noon tomorrow, then, Kent said, still looking at Chloe. We'll see what's legal and what ain't. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, but his presence lingered like thunder after lightning. The crowd began to disperse, moving in uncertain clusters, voices low and troubled. Thompson and another agent marched Chloe to the hotel. They thrust her into a second-floor room, the key turning with a heavy click. Rest well, Miss May, Thompson mocked through the door. Tomorrow you'll learn what happens to girls who stand in Progress's way. Chloe waited until their footsteps faded. Only then did she sink onto the narrow bed, her legs trembling. Outside the window, snow fell in thick curtains, and a gibbous moon cast pale light through the swirling flakes. She drew her mother's Bible from her skirt pocket. They hadn't thought to search her. The worn leather was smooth beneath her fingers as she opened to the Psalms. Her mother had marked certain verses with pressed flowers, teaching Chloe to find strength in ancient words. "The Lord is my light and my salvation," she whispered, voice gaining strength. "Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Moonlight pooled around her as she prayed, remembering her mother's steady faith through illness and hardship. "When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell." Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice remained firm. "Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident." Across town, in the stable loft where he had taken shelter, Kent methodically sharpened his knife against a whetstone. The steady scraping sound matched his heartbeat as he tested the edge. Satisfied, he moved on to checking his rifle, cleaning each part with practiced care. But his thoughts kept returning to Chloe, her gentle hands mending his shirts, her clear voice lifted in hymns, her quiet dignity even in the face of mockery. She had brought life back to his cabin, and his heart, filling empty spaces he had thought long dead. The knife gleamed in the lantern light. Kent had killed men before, during the war and after. Violence came easily to him, a familiar path. But Chloe's way was different. She met cruelty with courage, hatred with grace. She made him want to be better than his scars and shadows. "I won't lose you," he whispered into the darkness. "Not to them. Not to anyone." The snow fell thicker outside, blanketing the town in hushed white. In her locked room, Chloe knelt by the window, prayer beads sliding through her fingers. In the stable loft, Kent wrapped his weapons and closed his eyes, but sleep eluded them both. Tomorrow would bring judgment, one way or another. The railroad's money against a woman's inheritance, greed against grace, violence against faith, and between them all, love that had bloomed unexpected as a desert flower, too precious now to lose. The moon sailed behind snow clouds, and Silver Creek waited in darkness for dawn. The courthouse bells tolled 12 times as noon arrived in Silver Creek. Through frosted windows, weak winter sunlight filtered into the crowded room, catching dust motes that danced like snow. Every wooden bench groaned under the weight of townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the chilly air. They had come for spectacle, for drama, for the sight of a woman brought low. Sheriff Turner led Chloe May forward, iron shackles clinking at her wrists. Her plain brown dress was wrinkled from her night in custody, but she had managed to smooth her hair and tie it back neatly. The chains seemed absurd on someone who had never shown violence, a clear attempt to shame her before the town. Judge Caro sat behind his elevated desk, arranging papers with theatrical importance. His black coat gleamed with careful brushing, and a gold watch chain draped across his vest. Everything about him spoke of purchased dignity rather than earned respect. "The court will now hear the matter of the Thunder Spring property dispute," he announced, his cultured voice carrying to the rafters. "Railroad interests versus the claimed inheritance of Miss Chloe May." "The railroad's lawyer, Mr." Whitaker rose from his seat. His fancy suit and polished boots marked him as a city man, unused to frontier mud. A sneer played at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed Chloe. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is quite simple. We have documented evidence that James May sold the water rights to Thunder Spring before his death. His daughter's claim is invalid, likely forged by her or her," he paused meaningfully, "Mountain Man Protector." Titters ran through the crowd. Chloe's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin. The ranchwoman sitting in the front row reached out to pat her hand encouragingly. Judge Caro nodded, barely glancing at the papers Whitaker presented. "These seem to be in order. Miss May, do you have any response to these serious allegations?" Chloe stepped forward. Though her voice shook slightly, it grew stronger with each word. "This land was my mother's, left to me by law. No man can take it with lies." She reached into her skirt pocket with her shackled hands. "I have the original deed here, signed by the territorial governor himself." "Hearsay and forgery," Whitaker interrupted smoothly. He turned to address the crowd directly. "Are we to believe that this woman, sold by her own father for whiskey debts, somehow has legitimate claim to the most valuable water source in the county?" Before anyone could respond, the courthouse doors swung wide with a bang that echoed like gunfire. Cold air rushed in, and with it came Kent McKenna. He filled the doorframe, his massive frame wrapped in his buffalo coat, his face still bearing bruises from the railroad men's ambush, but his eyes blazed clear and steady as he strode down the center aisle. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Men shifted uneasily, remembering tales of Kent's prowess with rifle and knife. Even Judge Caro's carefully maintained expression flickered. Kent stopped beside Chloe. Though he carried no visible weapons, danger radiated from him like heat from a forge. "She will not stand alone," he declared, his deep voice rolling like distant thunder. "This is a legal proceeding," Judge Caro began, but Kent cut him off. "Then let's have truth before the law." He turned as the preacher stood up from his bench. "I can speak to Miss May's character," Reverend Walsh said firmly. "She has attended our church faithfully, even in the hardest times. Her mother's dying wish was that she inherit that land." The ranchwoman rose next, her weathered face stern. "I nursed Elizabeth May in her final days. She made me witness her will, leaving everything to her daughter. That spring was her dowry gift to Chloe." Quiet footsteps padded forward as the young Apache boy, Joseph, moved to stand before the judge. Though barely 12, he spoke with clear conviction. "Miss May taught me letters when others called me savage. She shares the spring water with all who ask, unlike the railroad men who fence everything they touch." More townspeople began standing. The mercantile owner who praised Chloe's accounting skills, an old trapper who had known her mother, the blacksmith's wife who remembered Elizabeth May's kindness during drought years. The momentum shifted like wind before a storm. Judge Caro's eyes darted between the crowd and Whitaker, who was making urgent gestures toward his coat pocket, where, no doubt, a purse of railroad gold waited. But the weight of all those watching eyes seemed to press upon him. He cleared his throat. "I find myself compelled to examine these documents more carefully." He made a show of studying both sets of papers. The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Chloe's shoulders trembled slightly, and Kent moved closer, lending her his strength. At last, Judge Caro looked up. His face had gone pale, but his voice was firm. "The original deed presented by Miss May appears genuine, bearing the territorial seal. The railroad's purchase agreement," he paused, "shows signs of irregularity. This court rules that the deed stands. Miss May retains full rights to Thunder Spring and all surrounding property." The courthouse erupted. The railroad men cursed and stormed toward the door, Whitaker gathering his papers with shaking hands. "This isn't over," he spat, but his threat sounded hollow beneath the rising cheers. Sheriff Turner stepped forward to unlock Chloe's shackles. As they fell away, her legs buckled with relief. Kent's arm shot out to steady her, strong and sure as it had been that first night he had lifted her down from his sled. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at him through tears of joy. "For everything." Kent's bruised face softened as he gazed down at her. The townsfolk were gathering around them now, the preacher offering prayers of thanks, the ranchwoman declaring they needed celebration, Joseph grinning as he helped gather Chloe's papers. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending bright shafts through the courthouse windows. They fell across Chloe and Kent like a blessing, touching her hair with gold and gentling the hard lines of his face. Around them, the community that had once mocked now offered congratulations and support. They had won more than land that day. They had won respect, justice, and the right to stand tall before any who would try to break them down. Townspeople spilled out of the courthouse into the snowy street, their excited voices filling the crisp afternoon air. The mood had shifted like weather on the mountain. What began as dark clouds of judgment had broken into rays of unexpected warmth. Chloe May stood at the top of the wooden steps, still dizzy from their victory, Kent McKenna's steady presence at her shoulder keeping her grounded. Mrs. Walsh, the preacher's wife, pushed through the crowd with tears in her eyes. "Oh, my dear girl," she cried, wrapping Chloe in a tight embrace that smelled of lavender and fresh-baked bread. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. To think what you've endured, and now look how He has lifted you up." One by one, townsfolk who had once crossed the street to avoid Chloe now approached with extended hands and lowered eyes. "Reckon we misjudged you something fierce," mumbled Tom Carter, the livery stable owner who had laughed loudest during the auction. "Hope you can forgive us?" Joseph, the young Apache boy, couldn't contain his joy. He bounced on his toes beside Chloe, dark eyes sparkling. "You showed them. Just like in the David and Goliath story you taught me." His grin stretched wide across his face as he looked up at Kent. "Though I guess you had your own Goliath on your side." Kent remained silent through it all, but his large hand never left Chloe's shoulder. His touch spoke volumes, protective yet gentle, like his whole being was attuned to her need for support. Each time someone approached, his fingers would tighten slightly, ready to defend if the words turned cruel. But they didn't. The ranchwoman organized an impromptu escort home. "Can't be too careful," she declared, eyeing the saloon where the railroad men had slunk away to nurse their wounded pride. "We'll see you safe to your door." And so they rode out, Kent and Chloe in his sled, followed by a procession of wagons and riders. The setting sun painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called its evening song. It felt like a celebration, like a wedding train without the wedding, all these people who had finally seen the truth of Chloe's worth. At the cabin, their allies helped unload supplies donated by the mercantile owner. Flour, coffee, sugar, even a bolt of cheerful calico fabric. "For curtains," he'd said gruffly, pressing it into Chloe's hands. "Place needs a woman's touch." The preacher blessed the home, and the ranchwoman left a fresh-baked pie cooling on the windowsill. One by one they departed, leaving Kent and Chloe alone as darkness settled over the mountain. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. The fire crackled in welcome, and everything Chloe had organized over the past weeks stood ready to comfort them. The swept hearth, the stacked quilts, the herbs hanging from the rafters. This was home now. Truly home. One not just by law but by love and courage. Chloe knelt beside her cot, hands clasped in prayer. Her voice trembled with emotion as she thanked God for their deliverance, for justice done, for friends revealed in former enemies. The lamplight caught the tears on her cheeks, making them shine like stars. Kent sat in his chair by the fire, watching her with wonder. His usual stoic expression had softened, revealing something vulnerable in his weathered face. "You saved me, Chloe," he said suddenly, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "I thought myself lost." She looked up, meeting his gaze. Her eyes shone with a light that had nothing to do with the lamp's flame. "You did the unthinkable," she replied softly. "Not by buying me, but by seeing me. When everyone else looked right through me, you saw who I really was." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Kent's shoulders slumped as if a great weight was lifting from them. Slowly, carefully, he slid from his chair to kneel beside her on the rough wooden floor. His head bowed, and for the first time in years, he prayed, not alone in his guilt and grief, but with another soul beside him, their faith mingling like two streams joining to form a river. The cabin held them in its warm embrace as their whispered prayers rose together toward heaven. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the day's tracks with fresh white peace. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle dawn, painting the mountainsides with tender green and dotting meadows with wildflowers. The contested spring, now secured in Chloe's name through faith and courage, bubbled clear and strong beneath the warming sun. Winter's bitter memories melted away with the last patches of snow, leaving behind a peace as fresh as morning dew. One bright April morning, Kent and Chloe rode out together to visit their spring. Kent's mare picked her way carefully along the trail, while Chloe's horse followed, both animals carrying supplies for the day ahead. Chloe had packed a basket with fresh bread and early spring vegetables, while Kent brought tools to build something special, a bench where they could rest and reflect beside the life-giving water. The cottonwoods stretched their new leaves toward the sky, their branches dancing in the breeze. Kent chose a spot beneath the largest tree, where its broad canopy would offer shade through summer's heat. With practiced hands, he worked the wood, measuring and cutting while Chloe spread a blanket nearby. She watched him build, admiring how his large hands could be so gentle with the timber, just as they had been gentle with her heart. When the bench was finished, Kent settled beside Chloe, his usual stern expression softened by contentment. She opened her Bible, its pages worn smooth by years of faithful reading. Her voice carried clear and sweet across the spring-fed stream as she read from Psalms. "He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Kent listened, his eyes closed, peace etched across his weathered features. The same hands that had once known only violence now rested quietly in his lap. Chloe's words washed over him like the spring water itself, healing and pure. Throughout the morning, townsfolk began arriving with buckets and barrels to draw water. Each time hoofbeats or wagon wheels announced visitors, Chloe rose to greet them with the same kindness she showed to all. Women who had once whispered behind their hands now stopped to chat, sharing news and recipes. Men who had jeered at her size now touched their hats respectfully, grateful for the clean, cool water she freely shared. "Much obliged, Miss Chloe," old Jim Thompson said, lifting his filled bucket. "Never knew this spring could be such a blessing till you took charge of it." Children started appearing, too, sent by their mothers with small pails and big smiles. They knew Chloe's reputation for hospitality, and for the best biscuits in the territory. She never disappointed them, producing honey-drizzled treats from her basket as if by magic. Their laughter echoed across the yard as they played near the spring, their joy a stark contrast to the darkness that had once haunted this place. As afternoon lengthened toward evening, Kent and Chloe rode back to their cabin. But it wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was the beginning of something greater. Near the original structure, foundation stones marked the outline of a larger home, one they were building together. Kent spent his spare hours cutting timber and squaring logs, while Chloe planned the interior, already stitching curtains from cheerful fabric in anticipation of new windows. Kent stepped down from his horse and immediately went to split more firewood, his axe ringing against the logs in a steady rhythm. Chloe sat in her rocking chair on the porch, the curtains taking shape beneath her careful fingers. She hummed hymns while she worked, and sometimes Kent would pause in his chopping just to listen, remembering how her songs had first begun to thaw his frozen heart. Inside, the cabin glowed with the last light of day. Chloe moved about the kitchen, setting out their supper, venison stew, fresh bread, and early spring greens she had gathered. The table, once bare and lonely, now bore a clean cloth and 2 plates set close together. Kent washed up at the pump outside, then ducked through the door, bringing with him the scent of pine and honest work. They sat together in the warm lamplight, so different from those first uncertain meals they had shared. Kent bowed his head, his voice deep and sure as he spoke words that made Chloe's heart swell. "Lord, bless this home, and the woman who makes it whole." Chloe reached across the table and squeezed his large, calloused hand. Tears brightened her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not the bitter drops she had shed that winter night when he had first brought her here. She looked around at the cabin, at the curtains she had hung, the herbs drying from the rafters, the Bible on its stand by the fire, and saw not just shelter, but sanctuary. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild songs echoing across the valley. But inside the cabin, peace reigned. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Kent and Chloe sat together in comfortable silence, their hearts full of gratitude for how far they had come. Their story had begun in shame and desperation, a cruel auction, a desperate bid, 2 wounded souls thrown together by circumstance. But God had turned those bitter seeds into something beautiful. Where there had been loneliness, now there was love. Where there had been violence, now there was peace. Where there had been rejection, now there was acceptance, not just from each other, but from a community that had learned to see with clearer eyes. The spring that had once been contested now brought people together, its waters healing more than just physical thirst. And in the cabin that had once been cold and empty, faith and family bloomed like the wildflowers dotting the mountainside, proving that even the hardest ground could yield abundant life when tended with patience and grace. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.